gunshot echoed through Caleb Morgan's dreams every single night, pulling him from sleep with his heart hammering and his hands shaking like a man gripping the edge of hell itself. Spring of 1868 brought him to Redemption Creek, a dusty settlement in western Kansas where the railroad was pushing through and bringing new life to the prairie, but Caleb felt anything but alive as he rode his mare down the main street with his hat pulled low and his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The war had ended 3 years ago, but for him it might as well have been yesterday. The screams of dying men still ringing in his ears, the weight of what he had done pressing down on his chest until some mornings he could barely breathe. He had been a sharpshooter for the Union, and his rifle had claimed more lives than he could count, some of them barely old enough to shave, some of them just boys who had gotten caught up in something bigger than themselves, and now their faces haunted him in the quiet moments when he let his guard down. He found work at the Double R Ranch just outside of town, a sprawling cattle operation run by a gruff but fair man named Raymond Tucker, who asked few questions and expected hard work in return for room, board, and a modest wage. Caleb threw himself into the labor, rising before dawn to mend fences, brand cattle, and ride the perimeter checking for strays, hoping that exhaustion would bring him dreamless sleep, but it never did. The other ranch hands kept their distance after the first few attempts at conversation fell flat, sensing something dark and wounded in the tall man with the haunted gray eyes and the way his hand sometimes drifted to where his sidearm rested, as if expecting trouble even in the middle of the peaceful Kansas grassland. Raymond's daughter had died in childbirth 2 winters back, and his wife had followed her to the grave 6 months later from grief, leaving the old rancher alone except for his foreman and the rotating cast of cowboys who drifted through looking for work. Caleb had been at the Double R for nearly a month when he first saw her, standing in front of the general store in town with a basket over her arm and the afternoon sun turning her auburn hair to flame. Sarah Whitmore had arrived in Redemption Creek just 2 weeks earlier, a teacher from Boston who had answered an advertisement for someone to educate the growing number of children in the settlement, and she carried herself with a quiet dignity that made rough men straighten their backs and mind their language when she passed. She wore a simple gray dress that had seen better days, but she held her head high as she navigated the muddy street, and when she smiled at the shopkeeper's wife, it was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. Caleb stood frozen outside the saloon, a bag of supplies for the ranch forgotten in his hands, and for the first time in years he felt something other than guilt and despair stirring in his chest. He told himself to look away, to mind his own business and not inflict his darkness on someone so clearly good and pure, but his feet carried him across the street before his mind could stop them. She was studying a display of fabric in the store window when his shadow fell across the glass, and she turned with a startled gasp, her hand flying to her throat. Up close, he could see that her eyes were the color of spring grass, bright and alive with an intelligence that seemed to see right through the walls he had built around himself. He stammered an apology for startling her, his voice rough from disuse, and she smiled again, smaller this time, but no less genuine, and introduced herself with an extended hand that he shook carefully, afraid his calloused palm and the violence it had known might somehow contaminate her. They spoke for only a few minutes before propriety demanded they part ways, but those minutes replayed in Caleb's mind for days afterward as he worked the ranch. He learned that she was 24 years old, just 2 years younger than himself, and that she had come west after her parents died in a tenement fire, leaving her with nothing but a teaching certificate and a determination to start fresh somewhere new. She asked about his work with genuine interest, and when he mentioned that he had been a soldier, something flickered in her eyes that might have been understanding or might have been pity. He could not tell which. He did not mention the nightmares or the weight on his soul, but somehow he suspected she knew anyway, the way perceptive people sometimes do. The schoolhouse was a simple wooden structure at the edge of town, and Caleb found excuses to ride past it more often than necessary, telling himself he was just checking on the settlement's outskirts for Raymond. Through the open windows, he could hear Sarah's clear voice leading the children through their lessons, patient and encouraging even when they struggled, And once he saw her kneeling in the dirt during recess to bandage a boy's scraped knee with such tenderness that his throat tightened unexpectedly. She caught him watching one afternoon and waved, and he touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement before riding away quickly, his face burning with embarrassment at being caught. It was Raymond who finally pushed him to do something about his obvious interest, the old rancher looking up from his evening pipe one night to say that life was too short to waste on regrets, and that a man could not let his past steal his future. Caleb tried to explain that he was not fit for decent company, that the things he had done in the war made him unworthy of someone like Sarah, but Raymond just shook his head and said that every man who had fought carried scars, visible or not, and that running from them never made them heal. The conversation stayed with Caleb through another sleepless night, and when dawn broke gray and cool, he made a decision that terrified him more than any battlefield ever had. He cleaned himself up as best he could, shaving carefully and putting on his one good shirt, and rode into town with his stomach churning and his palms sweating. The school day was ending when he arrived, children spilling out the door in a noisy rush, and Sarah stood on the small porch watching them go with a smile that faded to surprise when she saw him dismounting. He asked if he could walk her home, the words coming out stiff and formal, and after a moment's hesitation she agreed, gathering her books and locking the schoolhouse door behind her. They walked in silence for a while, his horse trailing behind them on loose reins, until she asked what had brought him to Redemption Creek. The truth spilled out of him before he could stop it, words he had never spoken aloud tumbling over each other in his desperation to make her understand. He told her about the war, about the men he had killed from distances so great they never even knew what hit them, about the young Confederate soldier he had found wounded and dying who had begged for his mother with his last breath while Caleb held his hand because no one should die alone. He told her about the nightmares and the guilt that ate at him like a disease, about how he went to church every Sunday and sat in the back pew praying for forgiveness but felt nothing except the certainty that he was damned for what he had done. He told her that he had no right to be speaking to her at all, that she deserved better than a man with blood on his hands and darkness in his soul, but that he could not seem to stay away. When he finally fell silent, breathing hard, and waiting for her to recoil in horror, Sarah stopped walking and turned to face him fully. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice was steady when she spoke. She told him that she had lost her brother in the war, that he had been 19 when he died at Gettysburg, and that for a long time she had hated everyone who had been part of the conflict, North and South alike, for taking him from her. But she had learned slowly and painfully that hate only poisoned the person carrying it, and that the men who fought had been trapped in something larger than themselves, forced to make impossible choices in impossible circumstances. She reached out and took his hand, her touch gentle but firm, and said that she did not believe God condemned men for doing their duty, even when that duty required terrible things, and that perhaps he had come to Redemption Creek not to hide from his past, but to find a way to live with it. Her words cracked something open inside him, and to his horror, Caleb felt tears spilling down his cheeks for the first time since the war ended. He tried to pull away, ashamed of his weakness, but Sarah held on, stepping closer and placing her free hand on his chest, right over his pounding heart. She told him that crying did not make him weak, it made him human, and that maybe the first step toward forgiveness was allowing himself to feel the full weight of what he had done instead of trying to lock it away. They stood like that on the quiet street as the sun sank lower in the sky, and for the first time in 3 years, Caleb felt the tiniest flicker of something that might have been hope. Their courtship unfolded slowly over the following weeks, built on long conversations and careful honesty. Sarah did not shy away from his darkness, but met it head on, listening when he needed to talk and sitting in comfortable silence when words failed him. She told him about her own struggles with faith after her family died, about the anger she had felt toward God for allowing such suffering, and how she had gradually come to believe that perhaps the divine worked through human hands, that love and compassion were the tools by which grace entered the world. Caleb found himself attending church not out of desperate guilt, but because she sang in the small choir, her voice rising clear and pure above the others. And afterward they would walk together through the greening prairie, talking about everything and nothing. He began to sleep better, the nightmares still coming, but less frequently. And when they did, Sarah was there in his waking thoughts, her face a talisman against the darkness. Raymond noticed the change in his ranch hand and approved, going so far as to invite Sarah to Sunday dinner at the ranch house, where she charmed the crusty old rancher by asking intelligent questions about cattle management and listening to his stories about the early days of the settlement. The other ranch hands ribbed Caleb good-naturedly about his sweetheart, and he bore it with better grace than he would have thought possible, even managing to smile when they teased him about being love-struck. But the past has a way of reaching forward to claim what it believes it is owed, and Caleb's came calling on a hot afternoon in early July when 3 men rode into Redemption Creek asking questions about Union veterans. They were Confederate soldiers who had never quite accepted the war's end, bitter men who blamed the North for the destruction of their homes and way of life, and they had been drifting west, leaving violence in their wake. Someone in town mentioned Caleb, probably meaning no harm, and by the time word reached the Double R that the men were looking for him, they were already on their way to the ranch. Caleb was working in the barn when they arrived, and he heard the commotion in the yard, Raymond's raised voice, and the sharp retorts of strangers. His hand went automatically to his gun belt hanging on a nearby post, and he felt the old familiar coldness settle over him, the battle calm that had served him so well during the war. He stepped out into the sunlight to see the 3 men on horseback confronting Raymond, and their leader, a scarred man with eyes like chips of ice, turned his attention to Caleb with a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. The man said he had been at Fredericksburg, that his brother had been killed by a Union sharpshooter, and that he had sworn to make every Yankee shooter pay for that death. Caleb felt the weight of inevitability settling over him, the sense that his damnation was finally catching up to him in a very literal way. He told Raymond to go inside, to stay out of it, but the old rancher refused, standing his ground with his own rifle in hand. The other ranch hands were drifting closer, sensing trouble, and Caleb knew that if this went wrong, innocent people were going to die because of him, because of what he had done in a war that should have been over and done with. He began to unbuckle his gun belt, thinking that if he went unarmed, perhaps the men would just take him and leave everyone else alone. But a voice rang out across the yard, high and clear and furious. Sarah had arrived to bring Caleb lunch, a habit she had fallen into over the past few weeks, and she stood now at the yard's edge with her basket forgotten on the ground, and her face pale but determined. She marched straight toward the mounted men, ignoring Caleb's shouted warning, and planted herself between him and their guns. Her voice shook only slightly as she told them that the war was over, that continuing to fight it made them no better than the violence they claimed to oppose, and that if they wanted to shoot Caleb, they would have to shoot her first. The scarred leader laughed, but there was uncertainty in his eyes now because shooting an unarmed woman in cold blood was a line even he was not quite ready to cross. She pressed her advantage, talking fast, telling them that she had lost her brother in the war, that she understood their pain and anger, but that adding more death to the ledger would not bring back the people they had lost. She said that every man who fought had been doing what he thought was right, protecting his home and his beliefs, and that continuing to kill each other years after the surrender served no purpose except to create more grieving families and more haunted men. Her words rang out in the tense silence, and Caleb stood frozen, terrified that one of the men would shoot her, that his darkness would claim her life the way it had claimed so many others. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tension began to drain from the scene. The scarred leader looked at Sarah, then at Caleb, then back at Sarah, and something in his face shifted. He said that his brother had been 17, barely more than a boy, and that he had died scared and alone in the mud of a battlefield far from home. Sarah's voice was gentle when she replied that she was sorry, truly sorry, for his loss, and that she wished with all her heart that none of it had ever happened. She said that the only way to honor the dead was to build something better for the living, to choose peace and forgiveness over vengeance and hate, and that every day men like Caleb chose to live with their guilt and try to be better was a testament to the possibility of redemption. The leader sat his horse for a long moment, his jaw working, and then he spat into the dust and wheeled his mount around. He told his companions they were leaving, and though one of them protested, the scarred man cut him off with a sharp word. Before they rode out, he looked back at Caleb and said that he was a lucky man to have someone willing to stand in front of bullets for him, and that maybe he should spend the rest of his life being worthy of that gift. Then they were gone, disappearing down the road in a cloud of dust, and the silence they left behind was deafening. Caleb's legs gave out, and he sank to his knees in the dirt, his whole body shaking with reaction. Sarah was there instantly, her arms around him, and he clung to her like a drowning man clings to a piece of driftwood. He told her she was insane, that she could have been killed, that she should never have put herself in danger for someone like him, but his protests were undercut by the tears streaming down his face and the desperate way he held her. She smoothed his hair back from his forehead and whispered that she loved him, that she had known it for weeks now, and that love meant standing together against whatever came, even when it was terrifying. He pulled back enough to look at her face, to search her eyes for any sign of doubt or fear, but all he saw was certainty and a fierce tenderness that made his chest ache. He told her he loved her too, the words feeling both strange and right in his mouth, and that he did not know if he could ever truly be free of his past, but that with her beside him he wanted to try. She kissed him then, soft and sweet, and when they finally broke apart, Raymond was standing a respectful distance away, wiping suspiciously at his own eyes and muttering about dust in the air. The town buzzed with talk of the confrontation for days, Sarah's bravery becoming the stuff of local legend, though she brushed off the praise with embarrassment. Caleb found himself the recipient of new respect from the other ranch hands and townsfolk, not because of his war record, but because of the woman who loved him enough to risk everything. The nightmares still came, but they were different now, less overwhelming. And when he woke gasping in the darkness, he could ground himself in the memory of Sarah's voice and the knowledge that she believed he was worth saving. He proposed to her on a warm evening in August, taking her out to a spot on the prairie where wildflowers grew in riotous profusion and the sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. He had no ring to offer her, just his calloused hands and his damaged heart, and a promise that he would spend every day of his life trying to be the man she saw when she looked at him. She said yes before he even finished speaking, laughing and crying at the same time, and they sat together in the grass until the stars came out, planning a future that a few months ago Caleb would have thought impossible. They were married in September, in the small church where he had spent so many Sundays seeking forgiveness. The whole town turned out for the wedding, and even some of the ranch hands from neighboring spreads came to witness the union. Sarah wore a dress of pale blue that brought out her eyes, and Caleb stood at the altar in his best suit, feeling both terrified and grateful in equal measure. When the preacher asked if he would take Sarah as his wife, his voice did not shake as he said yes, and when they kissed to seal their vows, he felt something inside him shift and settle, as if a piece that had been missing finally clicked into place. Raymond gave them a small house on the ranch property as a wedding gift, a sturdy cabin that had belonged to his foreman until the man decided to head further west. Caleb and Sarah spent their first weeks of marriage fixing it up, painting walls and mending the roof and planting a garden in the small yard. She continued teaching, riding into town each morning on the gentle mare Caleb bought for her, and he continued working the ranch, but their evenings belonged to each other, spent cooking dinner together and talking by the fire and learning the rhythms of married life. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the north with bitter winds and heavy snows that turned the prairie into a white wasteland. The ranch work became harder, the cattle needing constant attention to keep them from freezing or starving, and Caleb spent long days out in the cold, returning home exhausted and half frozen. But Sarah was always there, with hot coffee and warm blankets and a smile that made everything worthwhile. They spent the long winter nights curled together, and she began to teach him to read better, patiently working through books with him and laughing with him over his mistakes until he could navigate even complex texts without help. It was during one of those quiet evenings, with the wind howling outside and the fire crackling in the hearth, that Sarah told him she was pregnant. Caleb felt a surge of joy so intense it was almost painful, followed immediately by terror at the thought of being responsible for a child, of potentially passing his darkness on to another generation. Sarah must have seen the fear in his face because she took his hands and told him that their baby would be born into love, that together they would raise a child who knew compassion and kindness, and that the best way to atone for the past was to build a better future. Her certainty steadied him, and he placed his hand on her still flat stomach and made a silent vow to be the father his child deserved. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter and into the early spring, Sarah blooming with health despite the occasional bout of morning sickness. Caleb became absurdly protective, fussing over her until she laughingly told him she was not made of glass and that women had been having babies since the beginning of time. But he could not help himself, the thought of losing her the way Raymond had lost his daughter filling him with cold dread. He read everything he could find about childbirth and infant care, and Raymond teased him mercilessly about becoming an expert before the baby even arrived. Their son was born in early June of 1869, after a labor that lasted through the night and left Caleb pacing holes in the cabin floor, while the doctor and a neighbor woman attended Sarah. When he finally heard the baby's first cry, thin and outraged, he nearly collapsed with relief. And when the doctor emerged to tell him he had a healthy boy and that Sarah was fine, he wept openly for the second time since meeting her. He was allowed into the bedroom to find his wife propped up against pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny red-faced infant wrapped in a soft blanket. Caleb approached cautiously, awed by the tiny human who was somehow his son, and when Sarah placed the baby in his arms, he was terrified he would drop him or hold him wrong. But the infant settled against his chest, and Caleb looked down into the scrunched-up little face and felt his heart crack open in a way he had not known was possible. This was his child, his flesh and blood, innocent and perfect and completely dependent on him. Sarah suggested they name him Daniel, after her father, and Caleb agreed, thinking that perhaps this new life could honor the dead while blazing its own trail into the future. Fatherhood transformed him in ways he had not anticipated. The nightmares receded even further, pushed back by the immediate demands of a newborn who needed feeding and changing and comforting at all hours. Caleb discovered reserves of patience he had not known he possessed, walking the floor with Daniel at 3 a.m, singing softly when the baby fussed, and marveling at the tiny fingers that gripped his thumb with surprising strength. Sarah watched him with their son and told him that he was a natural, that Daniel would grow up knowing he was loved and safe, and Caleb allowed himself to believe her. As Daniel grew from a helpless infant into a curious, energetic toddler, Caleb found that the act of raising him became a form of healing. Each milestone, first smile, first laugh, first steps, felt like a small miracle, proof that life could create as well as destroy. He taught his son to be gentle with animals, to tell the truth even when it was hard, to treat others with respect and kindness. And in teaching these lessons, he found himself absorbing them as well, becoming the kind of man he had always wanted to be instead of the killer the war had made him. Sarah returned to teaching part-time once Daniel was old enough, bringing him to the schoolhouse where he played quietly in the corner while she led lessons. The other children adopted him as a sort of mascot, the older girls especially delighting in helping to watch him during recess. Caleb continued working the ranch, and Raymond, who had effectively adopted them as the family he had lost, was a doting grandfather figure who spoiled Daniel shamelessly with wooden toys and peppermint sticks. The years rolled by with the steady rhythm of seasons and hard work. Caleb and Sarah added two more children to their family, a daughter named Emma born in 1871 and another son named Thomas in 1874. The cabin grew crowded and noisy, filled with the chaos and joy of children learning and playing and growing. Caleb built additions to give them more space, and Sarah taught all three children to read before they were old enough for school, passing on her love of learning. He still thought about the war sometimes, about the men he had killed and the choices he had made. But the memories had lost their sharp edges, worn smooth by time and love, and the daily work of being a husband and father. He came to understand what Sarah had tried to tell him that first day, that redemption was not a single moment of forgiveness, but rather a lifetime of choosing to do better, to be better, to meet each day with compassion instead of violence. He would never forget what he had done, but he had learned to carry it without letting it crush him. Raymond passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1876, leaving the Double R Ranch to Caleb in recognition of the years of loyal service and the family that had brought life back to the property. It was a staggering gift, one that ensured security for Sarah and the children, and Caleb accepted it with gratitude and a determination to honor the old rancher's memory. He proved to be a capable owner, fair with his employees and shrewd in his business dealings, and the ranch prospered under his management. Sarah eventually stopped teaching at the town school to focus on their growing family, but she never stopped educating, turning their home into a place of learning where books were treasured and curiosity encouraged. She and Caleb made sure their children understood the cost of the war their father had fought in, teaching them about the importance of peace and the dangers of hatred, hoping to raise a generation that would choose dialogue over violence. Daniel grew into a thoughtful young man who loved working with horses. Emma became a voracious reader who dreamed of becoming a writer. And Thomas showed an early aptitude for mathematics that suggested he might become an engineer or architect. Caleb watched them develop into their own people with a pride that sometimes left him speechless, still amazed that he had been given this second chance at life. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Caleb took Sarah back to the spot on the prairie where he had proposed, the wildflowers once again in bloom, and the sunset painting the sky in familiar shades of gold. They sat in the grass as they had all those years ago, but now their hands were weathered with work, and their faces lined with the passage of time. He told her that she had saved him, that without her faith in his ability to be more than his worst moments, he would have been lost. And she smiled and said that they had saved each other, that love was always a mutual rescue. He kissed her as the stars began to emerge, and in that moment he felt something he had thought forever beyond his reach: peace. Not the absence of memory or regret, but the deep, abiding knowledge that he had done his best to make amends, that he had built something good and lasting from the ashes of his past. If there was a heaven, he no longer feared being turned away from its gates, because he had already found paradise in the laughter of his children and the love of the woman who had refused to let him give up on himself. They returned to the ranch as darkness fell, to the home they had built together and the life they had created, and Caleb Morgan, former soldier and reformed sinner, walked through his door with his wife's hand in his, knowing that redemption had come not through divine intervention, but through the simple, profound act of letting himself be loved. The nightmares were gone now, replaced by dreams of the future, of grandchildren he would someday hold, and stories he would tell them about how their grandfather had once been lost but found his way home with the help of a brave woman from Boston who believed that no one was beyond saving. And in the quiet of the night, with Sarah sleeping peacefully beside him and his children safe in their beds, Caleb finally understood that he had not been damned at all, merely tested, and that he had passed that test by choosing love over despair, hope over guilt, and life over the darkness that had once threatened to consume him. The war would always be part of his story, but it was no longer the story's end, merely a chapter that had led him to this moment, this family, this hard-won peace that felt more precious for having been so dearly bought. He had feared damnation for the things he had done, but Sarah had shown him that love was not just capable of saving him, It had already done so one day, one choice, one moment of grace at a time, until the man he had been was transformed into the man he had become. And that transformation was the truest form of redemption he could have ever hoped to find.